Coming up on today's episode of the Salesman Podcast.
What we humans care about more than anything else is each other's intent. It's very difficult to tap somebody on the shoulder before the meeting and say, well, there's this little thing that you tend to do in meetings. I just wanted to warn you, don't do that in this meeting because the folks we're meeting with are very sensitive to that. And if you start doing what you would do in the meeting, they're going to hate you, and that's the end of the meeting right there. Trust is different online versus in person. Trust takes time, first of all.
Hello, Sales Nation. My name is Will Barron, and I'm the host of the Salesman Podcast, the world's most downloaded B2B sales show. On today's episode, we have Nick Morgan. You can find out more about Nick over at publicwords.com. And on today's episode, we're getting into how you can stand out on the stage, that is Zoom, Microsoft Teams, Skype, wherever you're communicating virtually online. We get into body language, vocal tonality, and a whole lot more. So with that said, let's jump right into today's episode. Nick, welcome back to the Salesman Podcast.
Will, it's great to be back. We little thought when we spoke last that we'd be at this virtual relationship forever, but here we are.
Here we are. And I don't think things are changing anytime soon from the look of things. So with that, you've teed things up perfectly. We're going to talk about on today's show, we're going to talk about how we can bring a bit of life to our Zoom calls. When we're on that stage of a Zoom, Skype, Microsoft Teams, whatever it is, how we can add a bit of life and energy to those conversations. And it's clearly not just sales professionals who are doing this at the moment. So this might be applicable for people outside of that realm as well. Now, I want to start the show by being hopefully isn't a lazy question. I wanted to be massively open-ended here just to get your thoughts before I start leading us down different pathways. What has changed, or what needs to change when we shift from a face-to-face sales meeting, sales conversation, when we're trying to influence people, we're trying to entertain them, we're trying to somewhat persuade them to our way of thinking and our products and services? What's changed in the virtual world versus how we go about things in the face-to-face world, Nick?
Yeah, that's a good place to start. Everything changes. That's the bad news. It really does. And the reason is a little nerdy, so I'm going to start nerding out instantly on this. What we humans care about more than anything else is each other's intent. So what I care about when you call me up and say, Nick, come back on the show is what's your intent? Are you a friendly person? Are you going to sandbag me? Are you going to try to catch me out on some question I don't know the answer to? I mean, that sounds a little paranoid, but that kind of question, friend or foe, is the first basic question that we ask of every other human being, especially when we meet them for the first time, especially if we don't know them well. And then beyond that, we ask questions like, is this person more powerful or less powerful than me? Can I trust this person or not? And those are, of course, questions that you ask of salespeople and that salespeople ask of the potential customers. Is this customer for real, or is he or she just window shopping? Is this person making legitimate claims, or is this person going to turn out to be insolvent and completely useless? So there's a whole series of questions that you ask more or less unconsciously. Those are questions to intent. That is, what is the intent of the other person? Now, the reason everything changes online is that most basic question becomes much harder to answer satisfactorily online. And the reasons for that are quite nerdy, are quite detailed and specific, and they vary according to the technology. But just in the technology we're using, the Zoom call or the Skype call or the Teams call, whatever video conferencing facility you use, we are moved from a three-dimensional face-to-face view to a two-dimensional view. And while we modern humans are very used to looking at photographs and TV and the movies, and so we think when we see an image, a two-dimensional image, that we know how to translate it into three dimensions. We actually don't, and we're not very good at it, surprisingly. And so we lose these questions, or we lose focus on these questions of attitude and intent. So that's where it starts. That's why everything's different. And then we can get into the details of how it's different. But the first thing to understand, as I say, on video conferencing is going from 3 dimensions to 2. Even though I think I'm seeing your face, your face is still flattened out into 2 dimensions. And as good looking as you are, well, in 2 dimensions, in 3 dimensions, all those facial planes come back, and I can see more seriously. I can see your expressions much more thoroughly than I can on a video conference. And so, not being able to read your expressions as clearly in a video, I don't understand your intent. Not understanding your intent, then I have all kinds of questions that I'm immediately going to be asking.
Just to double down on one thing you said there, Nick, in particular, you said the word, I don't know if you use subconscious or unconscious, but these are all things that are happening in the buyer's brain. They're not consciously thinking, do I trust this person? Is this person more powerful than me? What is the overall intent? Is that correct?
That's right. These are all questions that our unconscious minds ask of each other. They're more powerful because they're unconscious, because you're not consciously aware of them. And so they get asked and answered before your conscious mind engages. So you get that funny feeling, I'm not sure if I trust this person or not. And that means that question has already been asked and answered, in effect. And because it's unconscious, it's therefore very fast and very hard to change once it gets asked and answered. So it's all the more important to pay attention to them. They're powerful.
Sure. And how much of this, we might digress slightly here, but how much of this comes from the fact that you turn on a call and you're there, you're having the conversation, then you turn off the call, versus when we meet people in person, you walk into the room, you probably shake hands, you probably have a few words that you wouldn't do on a Zoom call prior. You sit down, you might get out your files, and there's so much body language, and you can tell if someone's up to something, if they're nervous, if they're excited, if they're happy. How much of the communication is lost just by the fact that we're chopping off either end of it by having an online virtual meeting?
That's a great point, and one that people don't think about much. Although I've talked to a number of leaders recently who are trying to lead people, lead their teams on video conferencing, and they report this problem. It's very difficult to tap somebody on the shoulder before the meeting and say, well, there's this little thing that you tend to do in meetings. I just wanted to warn you, don't do that in this meeting, because the folks we're meeting with are very sensitive to that. And if you start doing what you would do in the meeting, they're going to hate you, and that's the end of the meeting right there. So a little word to the wise, that kind of thing you can do casually and in a way that can feel supportive and friendly, just like the chit chat you're sort of alluding to at the beginning or at the end of a meeting. All of that becomes awkward and forced on a video conference because it's set to begin at a certain time, and you can chat a bit, but that chat doesn't feel as relaxed and as natural as it would face-to-face for some of the reasons that we're discussing and a few others besides.
So I feel like, and I'm going to blow this out of proportion slightly, for the power element that you mentioned, we could over-exaggerate this and make it really awkward, and we could sit on a high table and point our webcam down at the person that we're engaging with if we wanted to try and manipulate them in that way. Clearly, it wouldn't work in reality, but I feel like there's physical things that we could do to increase perceived power, reduce it. We could dress higher status than the individual. We could dress lower status than the individual. But the trust element of this is what I really get stuck on, because I have no idea how we can, other than try and have a bit of chit chat before a call, what else can we do to build that element of trust on a Skype business meeting?
That's the challenge. It's quite difficult. Trust is different online versus in person. Trust takes time, first of all, and the very nature of a face-to-face conversation allows for a bit of that time. You do get the chit-chat beforehand. You do begin to relax with the person before you start business, the business part of the discussion, and then, of course, trust in a different way takes time. It can take months or years to develop real deep trust with somebody. Online, we substitute something that's quite different for trust. We don't trust in the same way. What we substitute is consistency. And so if somebody's inconsistent online, we tend to assume they are ne'er-do-wells or up to no good, or dangerous lunatics or something. The person who in a face-to-face meeting is used to being able to crack a joke or two occasionally will find him or herself struggling online if you go for 20 minutes on a Zoom call, let's say, and then suddenly throw in a joke. It can feel inappropriate, even if you feel like you know the other person, because you don't have that sense of connection that that you do in a face-to-face meeting that comes about automatically just from being in the same room. And let me be clear, there's a very specific neuroscientific reason why we do that, and or why we do trust somebody in that way face to face, and why it's hard to do um, online. And that is that when you meet somebody for the first time, um, or even meeting with an old friend face to face, there's a lot of what we call unconscious mirroring going on. And so as we sit there, we tend to adopt the same posture. And coaches like me, people who teach body language, will train people to mirror deliberately in order to increase trust if you want to win over the opposite party in some way. But we all do it naturally, and it's not manipulative or nefarious in any way. It's just a natural part of how humans get on the same wavelength. When we sit down, we're trying to meet with our opposite party at a another company that we're negotiating with, say, or on a sales call. We want to get comfortable with one another, because the alternative is much worse. Who wants to have an uncomfortable conversation for an hour, right? So we humans naturally, unless we're feeling very combative, we naturally mirror each other's behavior. Now, what we tend to mirror is large body language movements. So we'll sit in motion. We'll sit in the same posture. We'll sit the same way in a chair, or we'll both lean forward over the table that we share at the same moment, or that kind of thing. That sort of behavior is very difficult to do well, to mirror well on a video conference, because it's two-dimensional. And so really my motions are reduced to a very few simple things. I can lean into the camera, but that's going to look weird if I lean in too far, and your natural reaction is going to be to lean back rather than leaning in slightly. So you lose a lot of the subtlety of the possibilities of mirroring, and so we don't build up trust as fast or as much um, in these online meetings. And that's a fact which a neuroscientific fact, which is just very difficult to get around.
So,
You can do it a little bit, and there are strategies we can talk about. Just to give you one, for instance, you can mirror the language of the other person. So if you start talking and you use the word sales incessantly, then I might use the word sales more frequently than I normally would too. That's not as effective as mirroring body language, but it helps a little.
Sure. There's two things. Well, it's three things. One, I have this phenomenon regularly when I meet guests that I've interviewed, like we've spoke a number of times now, Nick, when I meet them outside of the podcast, and we're at a sales conference, which obviously don't exist anymore, or I see them in an airport, whatever it is. It happens every time. I get told, wow, you're way taller than I expected you to be, because I've obviously sat down at this desk and there's no context for my height. And I also get told, and it sounds like I'm trying to blow my own trumpet here a little bit, but this is what I get told, that I'm a lot more funny than I am on the podcast itself. So when you're talking about cracking a joke on a Zoom call or a online meeting, I find it really difficult to crack the jokes and the banter in that little bit of back and forth that I do in person. I don't know whether it's because there's that slight delay in the audio video being transmitted from you to I. I don't know whether it's a confidence thing. Maybe to go back to what you said earlier then as well, maybe I feel less relaxed on a Zoom call. As you know, I've done 700 of these interviews now, if not more, considering I've been in other people's shows as well. And I feel like I'm relaxed. Mm-hmm. But it's definitely different versus being in front of someone and you can gauge them a little bit easier. So just a number of phenomena that you're talking about there, Nick, I've felt firsthand. So you mentioned then, I guess, mirroring people's the words that they're saying. Is there anything else that we can do to kind of build that level of trust that might come organically and naturally, that we're not trying to increase the level of trust, we're just trying to get it back to where it would be in a face-to-face meeting?
Yeah, there are two things you can do which sound mutually contradictory, but they're not. The first one is to listen more than you talk, and that's good advice in person too, that I'm sure your listeners and viewers have heard many times, but it's even more important on video conferencing. And then the second one is to do what we call go first, meaning the beginnings of a conversation tend to set the tone and the expectations. And if I start by telling you a heartrending story of some trauma that I've suffered, and thereby enlist your sympathy, and you realize what a wonderful, authentic, courageous guy I am, then that will take our conversation in one direction. If, on the other hand, I talk about my favorite football team, that will take the conversation at another level, and it means probably a missed opportunity, because when you're in person. Salespeople for years have gotten away with that kind of polite level of chit chat because your unconscious minds are busy doing the hard work of creating trust that you therefore don't have to do in the chit chat. So you can talk about football or sports or the latest happening of one kind or another. In the online world, you can't assume your unconscious minds are going to be doing that work. They're not. And so you have to do the work yourself through the storytelling, through the disclosures that you give. So you have to be a little braver in the online relationship and go deeper first. And you have to listen more, and you have to do both of those things.
That makes total sense. Okay, let's move on to something that I struggle with, right? I speak, and I know this because multiple people on this show, and you probably do the same in a second, Nick, have told me this. I speak way too fast. And there's other vocal tics and things that I have that if I was training to speak on stage, you and other people in the same kind of league as that you are in this would knock right out of me. Now, but I feel like I get away with a lot more in person than what I do on the podcast. And of course, you're talking through a microphone. It's then being translated into ones and zeros. It's then being transmitted for you and I across a vast ocean, and it's coming out of speakers or headphones at the other end. And so there are multiple points of failure. And even if it was 99% seamless all the way through, it could be anything at the other end that would scupper things up. So there's multiple elements to all of this that can make my not great kind of on-stage speaking voice just abysmal by the time it reaches your ears on a video meeting. So with that said, what's the biggest bang for buck thing that we should work on to improve our intelligibility or our ability to speak and be understood when we are communicated over a Skype call where people might be listening to this and go, well, this is all fine in person. I don't know why it's a problem now that we're communicating via the internet.
Yeah, the easiest thing to do, this is quite a complicated subject. And again, I could geek out or nerd out very happily on this, but I'll try to keep it simple. And I promise not to mention the Navajo code breakers of World War II and the insight that led to in terms of exactly the question you're asking. I promise I won't do that. Moving on. So now that I've got you wildly curious as to what that is, the simple thing you can do is to get very relaxed one evening with a couple of friends, if you're allowed to see any friends or talk to them in person. Let's say you've got a pod. I don't know if that's what you call it in the UK, but that's what we call it here, where we have a pod of people that we've been hanging out with this whole time.
We've got bubbles, Nick. Same thing, though, I think.
Bubbles. Okay, yeah, pods and bubbles. Good. All right. Well, what is it they say that something about the common language separated, or two cultures separated by a common language, or something like that. But so pods and bubbles. Get very comfortable with your bubble and have a chat with them, and then record your own voice when you're at your most relaxed, just having chit chat with your mates. At that point, your voice is going to be at the right pitch. It's going to be at the right level of relaxation. It's going to have the right music to it. Now, there's, of course, much more we can do with a voice, and there are other problems that voices have and work that can be done. But that's the simplest thing. When we get on a video conference, because of this feeling of being watched the whole time and the sort of sense of being on stage, what happens is that creates a low level of adrenaline flow. And one of the things that's very sensitive to in humans to adrenaline is the voice, and it tends to push the voice up just a little bit higher. And so you find yourself talking at about this pitch instead of your more normal conversational one. But if you have a good 30-second recording of you speaking at your most conversational, relaxed way, then you can play that in your ear before you do the video conference. that should remind you what your voice sounds like, and then you can replicate that more easily when you're on the call. Because the idea is not to unconsciously transmit that tension in your voice by allowing your pitch to rise slightly. Now, that's just ground level basic speaking 101 on video conferencing. There's lots more we could say, but that's a good place to start, and it's fairly easy for people to do. So I recommend that one highly, because that's something that most people aren't consciously aware of. And yet unconsciously, we humans are incredibly sensitive to tension in each other's voices. So it's an important one.
Perfect. I love that. Very practical. Everyone can do that this afternoon or whenever they can see their bubble or pod and put that into practice. I want to get into perhaps stage 2 or 3 in a second, but something that I am becoming conscious of as I chat with you, Nick, is, this is totally anecdotal. I don't have data on this, but the people I've spoken to recently who, like yourself, incredible speaker, versus people like myself, average speakers, when I've been doing these podcasts recently, I've noticed a trend, and you kind of blew it up in my face there, of the better speakers all tend to be doing the interviews stood up versus I'm sat down, clearly. And I found a lot of people that, and again, it's totally anecdotal, there's no data on this, people who I've found are less good speakers. They might have great things to say, but they don't have that stage presence. They're not perhaps trained in it, are sitting down for the podcast. Is that something that we should consider, whether it be from a body language perspective or a ability to speak clearly perspective? Should we be thinking about standing up in our meetings?
Absolutely. And here's the one very simple reason. When I stand up, it's easier for me to breathe than when sitting down. When you sit down, especially depending on what size stomach you have, you fold up the lungs there into your stomach a little bit. It makes it harder to breathe. When I stand up, I've got full access to all my breath. Voice is created by breath, and singers, for example, spend a lot of time training themselves to be able to sing for long periods of time without obviously gasping for breath, and sustaining the note requires breath and that kind of thing. So the singers already know this, but for us average speakers, then we breathe just fine unconsciously enough to keep ourselves alive.
That's not a very good baseline, that is it, for improving our ability to speak.
Exactly. And thank goodness that we do that. I mean, otherwise we'd all die in our sleep. But fortunately, we don't. We breathe. But it's harder to breathe sitting down than standing up. And all good vocal technique starts with breath. And so if you're speaking with insufficient breath, or you're a little short of breath, or you're not breathing very well, then that's going to put an extra strain on your vocal cords, and the voice is going to sound flatter, less resonant, which is a term of art that we like to use in the speaking world. Resonance is good. You get less resonance if you're sitting down. So long-winded answer, but I encourage everybody to stand up if they can, just because, again, it's a simple thing to do that will allow your voice to sound better, even on video conferencing.
Sure. It's an experiment I'm going to actually do. I don't know, we might have to rearrange the set, because clearly my head's going to get chopped off at some point on all these video podcasts that we do. But that's something that I'm going to experiment with and see if the audience notice a difference. So if that's ground floor, and perhaps the first set of steps is to stand up and get your posture right and breathe and focus on your breath as you're speaking, what else should we be doing then? You mentioned musicality. Is there anything else that we should be doing to even just add a little bit more energy to a call so it becomes less mundane and people start to listen to us?
Yeah, one of the things, for those who are not listening to this but watching it, one of the things which I'm going to demonstrate right now, and which will therefore have very little effect because I'm talking about it. This is much better if it's presented unconsciously. But one of the traps of the video conferences, again, tending to sit down, is all I see of you is your head and shoulders. And I get a surprising amount of information about how much you care about what you're saying from your whole body language. So I'll see you lean forward. It's that book that Sheryl Steinberg, what was her name? The Facebook VP wrote about leaning in, meaning take action, get involved, get confident and dominant in the room. When I lean in, then I'm much more much more present. I can be stronger. Um, that kind of body language is just simply harder to do sitting down and harder to see. So um, and so that's sort of 2.0. Where are we now? 2.1, 2.3. Yeah, so that's something that's really important to do. And I've completely lost track of your question now as I'm geeking out here. So ask me the question again, and I'll see if I can
So
answer
we've,
it
we've
better.
got standing up, we've got focusing on breathing, because this is something I get wrong all the time. I constantly run out of breath.
Right.
You mentioned leaning in. We can use our hands if we've got our hands in the shot, add a little bit more color to it. Is there anything else we can do in particular with our voice, perhaps, that makes things just a little bit more interesting to listen to? As again, you mentioned the word musical earlier on. I'm intrigued as to what you mean by that, Nick.
Yeah. Yes, that's where I was going, and that's what I lost track of was about the hands. I was saying we're sitting down, you can only see the head and shoulders, and leaning in isn't very effective on a two-dimensional call, although even that helps a little bit. But to bring your hands into it and wave them around brings back some of the body language that's missing. That was the point I was trying feebly to get to. So yeah. That's an important part of it, and that's what I was going to demonstrate. And as I say, it's less effective if I'm talking about it as I do it, just like any body language. The effect is supposed to be on the unconscious mind. But nonetheless, it does create more energy and animation if you can see me waving my hands around as I'm talking. So that is a crucial thing. That what we're really talking about here is a reduced palette. If you think of a painter and only allowing himself to use or herself to use three colors, rather than the whole rainbow of colors. When you limit it, then you have to use those few colors that you have more effectively, and you have to provide more variety with them. And the same is true on a video conference. You're limiting the palette here of things that you can do, and so you have to be more conscious of them. And you mentioned the musicality in the voice. That's one of them. So most of us naturally vary the speed and the tone and the music of our language, depending on whether we're being funny or we're trying to get more serious or we're cracking a joke or whatever we're doing. Online on a video conference, you have to do that even more so to the power of 10. You really have to work at it much, much harder. So you need to think consciously about slowing down and speeding up. You need to provide pauses in a way that you can get away with less in person. And you need to allow your voice to go up, to rise up, and to come back down. One of the classic problems that people have face to face is what we call the uptick or valley speak from Southern California, the valley in Southern California, where theoretically it originally came from. And that's the tendency to say everything as if it were a question, to let your voice go up at the end of every phrase. And that's gotten very common in, just speaking for American corporations. In American corporations now, especially ones with a younger cohort, because there's a great emphasis on collegiality. So I want to get everybody to agree with me. And so if I say everything as if it was a question, I'm kind of forcing you to agree constantly as we go along. Well, that's irritating enough in person and ineffective enough in person. But online, it becomes absolutely maddening. So that's something to watch out. So you want to add musicality in your voice, but you don't want always to be asking questions or to sound like you're always asking questions. So do allow your voice to go up, but then make sure you bring it down at the end of the phrase, so that you sound like you know what you're talking about.
So you've given us stuff, a few things here to add to our Zoom calls, but you've teed me up here nicely, Nick. Is there anything we should take away? Is there anything that we are doing perhaps in our Zoom calls that we think is what everyone else should be doing, or there's some weird social norm that hasn't quite translated into communicating via a video? Is there anything that we're all probably doing, even unconsciously, that we should take away from the conversations?
Oh, good question. Well, I like that one, because so often you're right. We think about adding things in. One of the issues that's surprisingly hard to get around for people is the norm that's been around forever, that when we have a meeting, it goes for an hour or half an hour. And the attention span, the research on this is not completely clear yet. We don't have enough of it, but the attention spans online seem to be shorter than they are in person. That would not be a surprise to discover. So let's assume as a working assumption that it's true. They seem to be about 7 to 10 minutes, the attention spans online. Now, it's very hard to schedule a meeting for 7 to 10 minutes because people are just used to at minimum 30 minutes or at minimum an hour, and they feel like they haven't done their work unless they go for the full hour. But one thing you can take away from Zoom calls, video conferencing, is that assumption and the norm, the heavily enforced norm that this meeting has to go for 30 minutes or half an hour or an hour, or it isn't successful somehow. You should feel free to make it shorter, and you should also look to vary what's going on about every 10 minutes, just to keep the interest level. Now, there's a caveat here that your audience should understand, and that is that attention spans are not what most people think they are. So most people think of an attention span as, oh my God, I've exceeded your attention span. That means you're on a rocket ship to Mars. I'm never going to see you again, right? You're gone. And that's the way we think about it. Oh, I've lost their attention, then I'll never get it back. Attention spans are easy to lose or easy to exceed, but they're also easy to get back. It doesn't take much to re-engage people. If they're there on the call with you, they want to make a success of that call. Or if they're there in person, let's hope we are able to do that again one day. People want to make that meeting or that exchange a success. And so they're in there with you, trying, and they can renew their attention. It's not that difficult, but you do need to mix things up, and you need to do that consciously in an online meeting, especially if you're pitching sales or something like that. Don't go on for 45 minutes just droning on about the brilliance of your product, for example. Allow for different modes and think of it in terms of chapters, 10-minute chapters, and make sure you're doing something different for each chapter. And allow for little breaks, but they don't need to be long. As I say, it only takes 30 seconds, maybe even 20 seconds to get somebody's attention back. You just have to give them just a little pass to say, okay, I can let go now, and then I'll come back.
I love this. So you used the word chapters, and what was pinging my brain as you were saying that, Nick, was to think of it perhaps in like acts as well, of there's a beginning, a middle, and end. If you break them into 7 minutes, you've almost got your 30-minute meeting there, but you change the dynamics, or you change it from me talking to a presentation or whatever it is. It's almost like a good way to structure a meeting or a presentation, just to kind of have those mental notes. And the other thing that I thought was fascinating was if someone emailed me asking for a 7-minute meeting, I'm probably, just because it's interesting as to how the hell are you going to explain all this in 7 minutes, I'm probably going to accept that just from a standpoint of it's different and it's differentiated, it's interesting. So they're the two things I took away from that. And no one's ever pitched me for a 7-minute, maybe we need to work on the wording so it's easier to say, a 7-minute meeting. No one's ever pitched me anything like that before.
Yeah, good fun. So then the challenge down to you to say something significant in 7 minutes. It's not easy, but I think it can be done. And it's a great way to think about your pitch. I like that.
All right. So just to
let's start. Let's say it started here, and now on your podcast, Will, the 7-minute pitch. I think
there's a 7-minute book series about sales and other stuff, I think. So maybe they've got the alliteration there before us, unfortunately, Nick. Right. With that, then. Final thing, and we'll wrap up with this. I've asked you this question, or a turn of phrase of this question a number of times on the show, so I'm going to change it slightly. Nick, if you could go back in time and speak to your younger self of 12 months ago before the pandemic hit, is there anything you would tell is there anything you'd tell him then to help him cope with all this change and turmoil and everything that's affected us during this global pandemic?
Yes, I would say that the hardest thing of all is to remain serene and focused in times of enormous change like this. And yet the game always goes to, and success always follows people who can remain focused and ideally serene while all this is going on. And so always be thinking about the long term.
Amazing stuff. We'll link to the books and all the good stuff of yours in the show notes of this episode over at salesman.org. Nick, is there anything you want to show the audience, anything you want to leave us with?
Well, one of the fascinating phenomena of this pandemic for me personally was a book that I wrote. I think we talked about this last time in 2018. Can You Hear Me? Which nobody wanted to buy in 2018, suddenly became relevant in 2020. So it's a horrible reason for a pandemic, and I
Very
don't suggest
selfish
that
reason.
I started it secretly. Yeah, exactly. I didn't start it, the virus in a lab just so that this could happen. But chances are good that you will not have much more time, because we're hopefully getting out of this in 6 months or so, to book me to speak on the subject of virtual communication. But I would love to come and talk to your group, whatever it is, about it, because it's a subject I'm passionate about, and we can make what we hope is the remaining few months of the pandemic much easier for us all.
Amazing stuff. Well, with that, Nick, I want to thank you again for your insights on this and for joining us again on the Salesman Podcast.
Thanks so much, Will.